let's dive into question one. Let's get into it. For folks who were here, and I guess who were around the country at this time, you know, in 2020, thousands of people marched and protested in the city of Portland, demanding racial justice. Some protesters called for police reform. Some called for defunding to drastically shrink the size of the police budget, while others called for complete abolition. Nearly 4 years later, some elected officials still think of police response when they hear the phrase public safety. We at Imagine Black, we believe this definition is way too narrow. My question to you, just getting into it, is what is your definition of community safety, and what are your plans to reimagine public safety in this role?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Community safety is a healthy society where people have their needs met, to me. It's preventative, it's holistic, it looks like help when you need it, and a government that doesn't harm you or is held accountable if it does. It includes things like safe routes to school, which does go back to paving the potholes. I am a sworn enemy of potholes, and we definitely need to address those, but also paving crosswalks and building sidewalks. I live pretty close to McCoy Park and the schools up there by New Columbia, and you know, we have a lot of kids that are going to and from school, and there's no crosswalks to get across to and from the park. A lot of housing in that area. That's a core part of safety, is ensuring the traffic isn't going to prevent someone from getting home safely at the end of the day. It also looks like scaling up, fully funding and expanding Portland Street Response so that it's 24/7 citywide and able to respond to a wide variety of calls that come into 911. It includes active spaces. So activating space is when you take a location that might not have a lot of pro-social activity, community life in it, and you put that in there so that there isn't space for antisocial activity or crime to grow. And we can do that with city policy. We can also do that, and a lot of the time it's just getting out of the way and allowing community to fill spaces. And when we do need responses, it's making sure we have enough dispatchers at 911 so the call can be answered quickly, and that we have ambulances so the response times are lower and people can survive whatever the ambulance is coming to address. We do definitely need to focus on the things you mentioned as root causes as well. So housing, healthcare, education, and food. I think we will probably end up talking about housing and homelessness at some point, I can just guess. But healthcare, as someone who is uninsured and then underinsured for a total of about 6-7 years in my 20s, this is something that matters a lot to me. In my day job, I help support the city's lobbying at the state. We definitely need to continue to advocate at the state level to get universal healthcare for everyone. Education, and you know, there's a lot that we can do to support the school districts, you know, PPS, but also all the ones that are a little east. I'm on the Parks Board, and so talking about parks and making sure that recreational programs are as used and as popular as the green spaces is really important. And that also relates to activating space. It also relates to making sure that government isn't just ensuring a baseline where we all survive and are able to economically contribute, but also where people can live full lives and thrive. And finally, food access as well. There's a lot we can do there in terms of helping low-income folks access food, building up community gardens as well, and then specific to, well, at least one district, this district, we have food deserts in the city. In North and Northeast Portland, there are large stretches where you can't find a good grocery store, and then additionally, even when there is one, I go to the Fred Meyer on Lombard and Interstate, and for years it was understocked. And you could go to a different Fred Meyer, same thing was for the Safeway. You go to a different one in a different part of the city and the shelves would be full. And there's things we can do, not all of that's policy, some of that's just leveraging the office to make a phone call and say, hey, this is a problem, and making sure that you're heard as a council member by that corporation to make sure it gets full. But definitely when root causes are addressed, we have a safer community.
Thank you so much for that. So much to follow up on. I want to ask a little bit for the folks who are watching and listening. It was mentioned a little bit earlier, we have a new form of government. What I'm most excited about this new system is really allowing for our folks who are elected into office to really focus on policy. You have kind of a great background and the privilege of also knowing what it's like to implement these policy decisions that are made. I'm curious to talk a little bit about the Community Safety Division, something that also came around the same time, about 2020, around the same time where folks were demanding racial justice. I'm curious kind of what's your, not your take, but what are your policy plans to support this office? How would you like to see this grow or evolve as kind of the city is changing in this moment?
Yeah, so first I should say I do still work at the city. I'm not representing the city. I do still work at what was the Community Safety Division. Technically, that's now doesn't exist by that name. It's part of the Public Safety Service area. When it was a Community Safety Division, it started up in April of 2021 with sort of being the leading edge of the charter change and consolidating the bureaus together. At the time, it was mostly supporting the existing public safety response system and helping to coordinate it. It had roles like ensuring that we have alternative responders, making sure that the right responder is going to each call, helping align governance, things like ensuring all the payroll and budget and procurement folks are together, and also helping to align and promote a safer Portland so that there are fewer 911 calls to begin with. And so I am very lucky. I was the first person hired after the director. And so I got to see it from the beginning to the end of that stretch. And it grew tremendously. We had about 75 people in it when it kind of was converted to the public safety service area. Now it does have a more hierarchical relationship. It's the umbrella over police, fire, Portland Street Response, 911, emergency management, Office of Violence Prevention, Safe Blocks, and more. And we need to make sure that we're supporting the work that it does, which includes still being sort of an internal think tank at the city, where we can see what's working, what's not working, performance analysis, things like that. But also helping to ensure that it's aligning the parts of the service area on things like professional standards, strategic planning, budgeting, and planning things out, and making sure that there aren't gaps where a certain type of issue is not being addressed by anybody because they all thought the other ones might be responsible.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Or the opposite, which is like behavioral health, where it's under a lot of people's responsibilities, a lot of different groups' responsibilities, and making sure that we're in alignment on what that means and not duplicating efforts. And so I think the way we can support it, I'm a big believer in the leadership there. I'm not just saying that because I work there. I say this when I'm off camera too, but I'm a big believer in them, and I want to make sure that we're supporting them getting information from community and having the resources that they need to succeed at getting our public safety system to align and move forward.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I've had just personally some great conversations with the folks a part of that team, especially in the very beginning when it was still a little scrappy, and opportunities, I would say, for so much input and ideas.
I love scrappy.
Yeah, scrappy's the way to go. I'm really curious to hear a little bit more. I think a little bit more about that last piece that you mentioned. Some great leadership, some great shifts that are happening. What I'm curious to know, what do you think we can do in terms of making sure that some of these great alternatives or these prevention programs that you mentioned a little bit earlier, are prioritized in this space? You know, it's I think we're moving a little bit. I think in 2020 was a time where we all got a chance to dream a little bit, to vision. I think almost everyone was reimagining something.
Yeah.
It was the fun buzzword at the time, but also it had some really good intentions of folks being willing to do something different. I'm curious, kind of within your policy space, do you find or do you think you have a lot of space for experimentation? Is this something that you're going to be pushing for, trying to try out some of these things that maybe you were thinking about in the current role or even with the old team?
Yeah, for sure. I didn't stop dreaming, right? I think that's the most important thing, that we still want a better world, and we still believe it's possible, both inside and outside of the city. And when I say we, I mean Portlanders broadly. I think that there's a lot of narrative about how political winds have shifted. We won't know till the election, and that's okay, but I'm going to stand on my values, and I think that Portlanders resonate with those values. In terms of alternatives, we still have a lot of things we can do. We've seen, I'll mention two things beyond the obvious. So there's, Portland Street Response, there's violence prevention, but beyond those, two things I'll mention is when we started Portland Street Response as a pilot and eventually got it to where it is now, we were ahead of the curve for some other cities. Seattle, for example, was behind us. They got their similar programs started later. But as Portland Street Response has sort of been held where it is, it's expanded in Seattle. to the point where now it's its own entire department, the care department up there, that has a chief. So they have a fire chief, a police chief, and a care chief. And that includes a lot of the alternative responders. We can do things like that here. We can scale up our additional types of response, because there are some types of calls for which the fire bureau is the right responder, and there's some that they're not. And for those, there have been places where there's gaps. Often those are the increasing volume of calls are in those categories too. Behavioral health is the main one. And so I think we can scale that up. Another example is with relation to the First Amendment rights and the use of protest rights. I have called for the creation of a new program called Portland Crowd Response, if you would like. You can call it anything you want, but something that would be the first line of communication and interaction with mass demonstrations. This would be a non-police program. I'm talking about, yellow vests, not riot gear, talking about traffic cones, not tear gas. And those are things that we can still dream about and look at doing. It has the benefit of being cheaper and more effective than some of the traditional responders, and help reduce the workload and clarify for the other departments that still exist alongside the new responder.
Thank you for that. For folks who are watching and listening, we're having this amazing one-on-one conversation, diving a little bit deep into community safety. You mentioned something else a little bit earlier before we go to question 2 about community participating. I know I mentioned quite a bit about a campaign that's currently paused, but it's around the budgeting, participatory budgeting. I also just know, as someone who loves participatory things and collaborative, is that we actually haven't done enough participatory work here in the city in terms of how people can get involved, whether it's the budget or other policy decisions. And I'm curious what your vision for how community members are embedded into the city, and how is it shared decision making? What does that process look like for you?
Yeah, if I had to pick one word, it's co-creation. And what that means is that government's not something different from you and I. It's a collective manifestation of the people. And so, first off, on participatory budgeting, I support it. I'm grateful to have the endorsement of some of the folks who led that plan. And while it is not going to get on the ballot this year, signatures aren't the only way to get something on the ballot. The city council can vote to send something to the ballot. I will do that, and I have committed to that publicly. And I think we need to have people more involved in the processes. I do community engagement and policy development. My current title is Inclusive Policy Manager. Again, not speaking for the city, but it's to connect that work of community engagement to the policy creation process, so that it's not a box we checked and a report that was written and published and looks beautiful and sits on a shelf, but it's something that actually affects the way in which our decisions are made at the city. And at the Police Accountability Commission, we had 1,500 people weigh in with direct comments, either verbally or in writing, hundreds more who attended meetings and watched along. And we can do that. That's a good model for a process, and we all know of other processes where things are in the back room somewhere, or they feel like they are. So those are things that we need to fix at the city. They're part of the culture that I talk about that we need to fix. And it predates the current council, by the way. This is a long-term challenge. The most common thing I hear doing community engagement is, I don't feel heard. And that's really sad, and we can do better. In terms of involving people, part of it's just being accessible, being able to talk to folks, and citing and actually engaging with testimony when it comes in. We've all seen meetings of the city council where hundreds and hundreds of folks come in and testify, and we need to engage with that in a meaningful way. So if 150 people wait 5 hours to testify against, a time, place, manner ordinance, for example, the first of which was last year, I sat in the back of the room for that one and watched it. And if I was up there, I'd like to think that I'd have a pause if 140 plus of those 150 people waited that long, on a weekday, to tell me that I was doing something they thought was wrong. Doesn't mean that I'd necessarily change my mind, but to engage with that and to think maybe it's worth waiting a week and just considering it, and engaging in a different type of format where you can actually have a one-on-one conversation with folks, ask your staffers, ask your experts. That's really important. And I think, so some of it is policy, I do think we should make it easier for people to weigh in on things. We should have some of our council meetings not be a 9 to 5 on a weekday. But part of it is just the culture of, does it matter to you when someone tells you, I disagree and this will harm me? And again, it doesn't mean changing your mind necessarily, but it means having the option that it might change your mind.
Thank you so much for that.